Good afternoon. We are back on Battlesnake Official, and today we're being joined by Anthony Vacca, the Director of Developer Experience at RBC. Anthony's going to be talking a little bit about what development actually looks like at RBC, how they tackle some of the really large technical problems there, and just what you could expect if you were ever to start considering being a developer at RBC.
Well, thank you, Noah, again. This has been a great opportunity. Battlesnake, having seen this for a few years now, as you guys are growing, it's been an exciting way to work collaboratively in the open source world. And that's exactly what we're here to talk about is the community aspect of InnerSource and open source at RBC, how it is a key part of our culture. And I'll take you through pretty much the day in life of what a developer at RBC is and why we find open source projects so important in helping our software development in Canada's largest bank. So open source has helped us build amazing things together. And one of my favorite stories of seeing this was when I saw a talk about this, and they used the analogy of the black hole and how the black hole was actually captured in a picture about a year and 2 weeks ago. It was published on April 10, 2019. And that black hole, although simple as it seems, was actually very difficult to capture. And it is on different levels of difficulty because not only was it a team of developers, as you can see here, and scientists that built software on their public GitHub that did instrumentation, data processing, theoretical modeling, infrastructure, but they used a lot of open source projects. And those 15 developers, it actually was just the tip of the iceberg. This is a great, some data I took out from Nat Freeman, the CEO of GitHub. When they look at the analysis of how many developers it actually took to build that picture of the black hole and the libraries they used, they calculated that it's not just 15 developers that made that great human achievement. It was actually 21,715 developers, which is an amazing feat to show the importance of how open source can really change the way software development is done. If you look at the top 1,000 open source projects on GitHub right now, the average amount of contributions is 7,403 people per repo, which is an amazing accomplishment when you look at how software development has come. Now, looking at new application software development, GitHub, again from github.com, about 80 to 90% of new application code is open source code. Again, I'll talk a bit about this later on, but InnerSource is also a big component of that, and new code is very small. And looking at how I actually code myself, I reflected a bit and said, you know what? Yeah, that is how it works. Because you look at myself, and I look at how I code. It's that standard, meme. Grab my Stack Overflow code. I got some GitHub code. Put it together. Get some help, and that's how I code myself. So I reflect when I joined this role as the director of developer experience, and I look at how do I want the experience at RBC, and I really want it to be like open source. So I try to think about when I joined this team about a year and a half ago, and I thought, what is open source? And the answer I came up with, open source is a culture. It's a way of working. And working with the partners at GitHub, and I got a great analogy from them, we pretty much try to put that way of working inside of RBC. And this term, open source, was coined in 2000 by Tim O'Reilly, and he also coined the term InnerSource. There's a great Wikipedia page on that you can definitely just Google. It'll be the first result back. But I like to actually describe open source as the P's and C's. You start off with a product. Let's say it's an apple tree, and I consume part of that product, say a green apple. Personally, I actually don't like green apples, so I'm actually encouraged to build and contribute and collaborate on building red apples. And by following the principles and practices of the community, we continuously improve the product. So now we have a tree with green and red apples. And I love a great quote from Joe Duffy from Microsoft, and him saying, I can honestly say that social coding often delivers 10 times more productivity and fun. So not only do you get a better working experience, you're getting actually a lot more productivity from the entire community. So Another great quote from one of our lead developers, who's our Aaron Clark, an RBC developer advocate. He was quoted on saying on our rbc.com/FutureMakers site, any contribution can make us be better as a whole. And that really is a key point to development at RBC. We have a open development culture where you could be a seasoned developer with 15, 20 years of experience working on a piece of code, or you could be a co-op student who has a couple of years of schooling and coming into RBC as a student, and wanting to make a contribution. You are coding side by side with a seasoned vet like Aaron Clark or any of the other thousands of developers that we have at RBC. And the reason why we like this culture so much is because at RBC, we no longer start on step 1. We're actually starting on step 3, 4, and 5. And the reason why that's so important, and again, it's Isaac Newton's favorite quote from myself, it's, if I've seen further, it's by standing on the shoulders of giants. And that's how we've really been able to develop our culture at RBC. Our development is no longer siloed. We actually work very horizontal. We have a lot of common components that we work continuously together, and we don't have that bureaucracy where you have to jump through hoops. The code is available, and you have to make a contribution. It's reviewed by our experts, and our developers actually learn more. And when people come into the RBC, they're actually coming out with years or more of experience, just because they get to have that access to seasoned developers. So people may ask, well, RBC is a bank, so why does really open source care and matter to a bank? So open source program offices, or I like to call them OSPOs, are delivering value for many companies, including banks. So if you go to the site, just the to-do group at the bottom of the screen, there's the link there. You'll find a great study that found 52% of global Fortune 200 companies either have an OSPO in place or are planning one. So the biggest companies in the world are starting to use open source more often. RBC being a top 10 bank in the world, we have an OSPO in place. There's about 70% of companies who frequently contribute to open source do hourly to weekly deployments, compared to 44% of those companies never contribute. I look at this as companies that do frequent deployments are more mature than companies that wait months to do a deployment. So when you look at companies that contribute to open source, 70% have that cadence of doing deployments hourly to weekly, whereas companies that never contribute is 44%. So more mature company, I infer more mature companies contribute to open source. Another quick fact is 73% of financial services firms use open source software. And RBC being one of them, we actually use open source as well. And another interesting fact is only 29% contribute. So there's a great opportunity for RBC and other institutions to actually start contributing back. And RBC, we're working towards building that capability to contribute back to projects. And finally, 81% of companies running an OSPO found that it had a positive impact on their software practices. And I can say, having been at RBC for 16 years, I started off as a co-op developer and progressed through my career. I can say the practices that we've employed early in my career to now have grown tenfold. The amount of maturity and practice, the pipelines, we employ a lot of DevOps pipeline processes are second to none. When I speak to our peers, we're the ones who people look to as, wow, that's pretty innovative. And we actually work with our peers to develop their practices. So a couple of things I'm not going to spend too much time on, and this is only a small list. I have, again, if you guys wanted to ask questions, love to hear them. And Noah, please jump in if there's any questions. I'm happy to be interrupted and talk about them. But I'll leave it only with the top 3, and I'm happy to comment on any other practices, pros and cons of open source. So number 1 is talent. We look to innovate in the open source community, and we wanted to attract the best and the brightest talent, as well as retain our top talent. Because working in the open source world is a want from our community. So we've heard that from our developers, and personally, I also wanted that, and that's why I've been a driving force with our organization to make that happen. Number 2 pro is the technology strategy. Now, there's some great literature. You can read about stories like the Symphony Project. But if you look at what happened with Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, they created a joint project that created the Symphony Project. And Google that, it's a great story, where they wanted a competitor tool to the Bloomberg terminal. And the reason why they wanted a competitor tool to the Bloomberg terminal is the Bloomberg terminal is actually a very expensive product that they purchase. It's actually owned by Michael Bloomberg, who was a Democratic presidential nomination, and he was famously seen as spending hundreds of millions of dollars on his presidential campaign. So he has money to spend, and the reason why is because his product is so good and it's so expensive. So for JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs, what they did was they supported an open source project that would compete against that. So the next time they're at the negotiation table with Bloomberg, they could have some leverage to say if Bloomberg does not work on price, those companies can then go to say the Symphony, and then they can actually have a second best alternative. And again, that worked. And now if you look at Bloomberg, that is one of their threats, as the Symphony project was recently evaluated at over $1 billion company in such a short amount of time, and it all stemmed from an open source project. And finally, brand. Brand is a key thing that RBC obviously cares about. We are one of the most trusted banks in Canada. We are a top 10 institution. We support a lot of great initiatives, and we want to be able to support, as the developer community, projects in the open source world. So we want to be seen as a company that gives back in many ways, from our past products to now developing and supporting open source projects for the greater good of the community. So again, like I said, there's a lot more pros, but I'll stop there because I could probably spend the rest of the time talking about that. Now to the cons. The cons of using open source, number 1 is security. And I have a couple slides that people can press pause on later on that talks about the Heartbleed and the Equifax that are well documented. But security is key, because downloading open source software, although it works and it helps solve business problems, it can open up data exfiltration opportunities for hackers. So at RBC, we take that very seriously to protect our clients, and we do a lot of scans, and we protect by ensuring that our software is as secure as can be, and we take that very seriously. And obviously, other companies have had some issues with that, and learning from using open source, and that is definitely a con to using it. Legality is also one where the authors of the code definitely have licenses in state, because they want people to respect those licenses. So we also want to make sure that we respect the authors and the software that they produce, and we respect the licenses and how they want that software to be used. So making sure that there's no legal ramifications of us using software, we take that also very seriously. And finally, the third con is reliability. It'd be worse if we use some open source software and the authors one day decide not to support the product. They could abandon it. We've seen it many times. Many projects have been abandoned, and that could be a risk, because now if we're using a piece of software, we don't have any more continuity, and it's either we take ownership of that project or we abandon it ourselves altogether. So there is a huge risk there. And again, we want to make sure that we're supporting the developers in the open source world. Again, we support the Finos and Linux Foundation to make sure that money is supporting the developer community as best we can. And again, like I said, there's also a lot more cons, but I'll stop at those top 3. So, like, the key thing that I want to leave with you guys on the channel is the impacts of open source software exploits are real. We must prepare the technology process and people to act accordingly to avoid the devastating results. And again, I'll leave the Equifax. You can download tons of articles on this, or you can look at the Heartbleed example, tons of examples of the impacts of not taking this seriously. So switching gears a bit, when it comes to open source software, it's used extensively in large organizations. I've only put a few on the screen here, We have some, the front end, Angular, React, Vue, to mid-tier, to Java, .NET Core, to operating systems like Linux and Android. Elastic's a great example. There's a lot of open source software that's being used in organizations, and it's something that organizations need to take on head first. So when looking at a strategy on how to build an organization, again, this is open to anyone to download. Just check out the Linux Foundation. I would say they're the godfathers of driving the open source culture. You can look at their approach, and it really is a base foundation approach of establishing that open source culture inside the organization. And I like that InnerSource is the key term there. And then it's a 3-horizon approach. It's first important to use safely and respectfully software, and that's the key, is managing the open source supply chain. So our strategy has been, we want to make sure that all the software that we use from the open source world, we understand what it is. We can manage its risk. If there's vulnerabilities, we can quickly patch them, and we make sure that the software that we use, any licenses, are respectfully being used as per the author's requirements. Second is, we want to contribute mindfully. As the largest bank in Canada, top 10 in the world, when RBC puts out information in the world, it has a lot of weight. So if we are using open source software, we make contributions back, it's a big deal. And we want to make sure that we pick the right projects that make the best sense. As in, we don't want to just hit any project. We want to make sure they're well-supported projects. We want to make sure that the development practices are very standard and they're very mature. So when we want to contribute back, we will take that into consideration, just because we want to reduce our risk, as well as supporting great projects. Finally, the third is lead strategically. And this is really about the Symphony project, as is my favorite example, when looking at Bloomberg and how they had a monopoly on the markets. With what JP Morgan and Goldman had done, is they decommoditized. They made the Bloomberg terminal a commodity product, and they were able to negotiate and leverage that play and to drive down price. Open source can also be a strategic avenue for monetization. There's a lot of things you can do strategically with open source that companies like RBC are seeing on how to leverage. Great things to do, also great social programs, as well as giving back. We do a lot of things with United Way. We've had many hackathons where we've donated the code as well. So there's a lot of reasons why you want to strategically use open source. So the first part of our strategy really started in 2018, and this is where it amplified our development. And it was the InnerSource approach. So InnerSource is applying the philosophies and practices of open source development within the enterprise. So remember that P's and C's thing that I talked about? If you take out open source, throw InnerSource in there's a logo, that's exactly what it is. And a lot of our development at RBC, as I said earlier, is around InnerSource. It may be open source, downloading in our organization and tweaking it for our own use. And I'll pause here for a bit to talk about the projects that we have. So in our InnerSource, in our GitHub, we have a ton of projects that we use InnerSource for. So all the way from our single sign-on, our UX UI, these are leading bank applications that have won many awards in the industry. And what's amazing to me is these products are, the base of them, key components are actually InnerSourced. So when people come into the organization, from a new grad to a student to a seasoned veteran of the industry, they can see the products and have access to making contributions to these types of products. It's because we actually want our community of developers to co-create our products together. So if a developer sees a bug, they are encouraged to make that contribution, and the maintainers of our internal InnerSource community will make those PR requests and approve them, or send some feedback back. And we do a lot of great practices like pair programming. We practice like TDD, test-driven development, behavior-driven development. So a lot of these practices are part of our lifeblood of how we develop software at RBC. So we also have a very mature life cycle. Again, this is just a depiction from the Sonotype. I took this from their slide. We follow something similar. I'm not going to go into too much detail of how we do our stuff. But it's all these setups are pretty similar, where we actually manage and maintain our data and our artifacts respectively and securely. So that's pretty much how open source InnerSource works at RBC. We have, and here's just a simple picture of the type of events that we run in RBC, where we bring all of our developers together on a monthly to bi-monthly basis. Again, obviously now we're in a virtual setting, but we do have a great, vibrant community where people are asking questions. We are co-creating projects. If you have a question, don't be afraid. We have a ton of experts that are willing to answer those questions and help guide our team. So I'll ask Noah to post in the chat 3 things. They're right at the bottom. It's the RBC presentation on InnerSource Commons. So if you want to learn a little bit more, you can see my talk that I did at last year's InnerSource Commons in Baltimore. It was a talk that we did with Slack to talk about how we built this culture. It's a great talk. I had some great feedback on it, and I'm happy to talk about that in the future. Again, I think I put my email in there. I'm happy for people to email me questions or talk about that. I also want to mention that I did mention that we have award-winning products, and just this past year, 2020, the Celeste Award for Top Global Digital Bank was awarded to RBC. It's an award that we've never won before, and this is the first year we've won it. We've won it for other things like the best innovation or best products, but we actually won Best Digital Bank, and it was a competition between 237 different banks, and previous winners were like Bank of America. So we fought really hard, and we've really transformed the way we do banking for our clients. So again, like I said earlier, we do a lot of co-development, and when developers come into the bank, they're so astonished at how open this organization is to collaborating. And I'd love to see new people come in and make a direct impact, because your impacts are pretty much to a top bank in the world. And finally, we have our API portal, developer portal. So we have again, check out the links. You can click on it. If you want to use our APIs, you can register as a startup, or as anyone who wants to check it out as for fun, as a hobbyist. You can actually register, get approved, and you can actually start hitting our APIs and using that in your development and your integrations. So with that, I wanted to leave enough time for any questions, and I want to thank everyone for joining the Battlesnake competition. I'll have our team, RBC, I'll be on one of them with my developer experience team participating, and we look forward to a great Saturday battling. So Noah, I'll pass it off to you if there's any questions, or open it up to the floor.
Yeah, we've got one question. Sorry, my Twitch just went off and now I've lost it. Give me 1 second here. Here we go. I've lost the Twitch chat. Oh goodness. Okay. My handy backstage hand is giving it to me. Here we go. Awesome. So the question is, do you have situations where you take InnerSource products and components and put them open source? And what does that process look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. We've had some instances where we would InnerSource things and go the other way around. We are, in the early days, we were a little trying to figure out the best approach and the best working model. We found that the best approach is actually not to do that. We actually want to contribute right back to the open source project. So if we do download, say, Angular, and we make enhancements to it, we want to, and we find a bug or something that we can contribute back, we're actually looking to actually contribute back to the open source project and making sure that our InnerSource project stays modular enough so we can always plug into this newest version of Angular. So that way, in the future, when Angular upgrades, we are easily to stay in line with their application development, and we don't go and fork and go two separate paths. So our goal now is to commit directly to the upstream fork.
Cool, awesome. I don't see any other questions coming in right now, but I had a question of just like, when you first rolled this out in 2018, I'm sure there's quite a big shift for such a large organization. What were some of the, I'd say, problems that you ran into as you made this shift culturally?
Yeah, great question. I actually have internally, people join RBC. There's a blog I did about this. So the biggest problems that we found were responsibility. So having a big organization, everyone was responsible for their own application code. And when you wanted to, if you move teams to another team, you lost access to your previous code. So if I had built a great widget and I moved teams and I wanted to reuse that widget, I could not. That was not possible. So when we brought the idea of InnerSource, the question was, who owns the product, who owns the code? Because it's not that team, it's not the other team. Now it took a while for people to figure out it's actually a communal code. So people actually figured it out that, I can actually own this as well. And then we found other people starting to own it, and it was a cascading effect. Once one project was successful, another one problem, and everyone just started jumping onto it. So it was really figuring out like who really owned the code, because it went from a very siloed to now a community-owned code. But great question. It was in the talk that I did with the link that you sent out at InnerSource Commons in 2019 in Baltimore. I talked about some ways to help change that behavioral. And one way we did it was we created a trophy called the Silo Buster. And it's if you actually go to the video and watch it, I actually brought the Silo Buster Award to Baltimore, and we're from Toronto. So I actually drove across the border because I couldn't ship that thing. So I drove it across the border. Customs looked at me weird because I had like this really weird trophy that looks like a hammer, and you gotta see it to understand. But we gave that award. So I built it, and I gave it to one team that I saw truly breaking down silos in community-owned code. And the only rule I had was I shall never give that trophy away again. And it's the next team has to give it to the next team, and it is a community award. And the current holder of it is responsible for finding the next person to award it to. And we give it every quarter. And I think we've now given it 7 times. And it becomes a proud mantra that people can say we were part of that. We truly broke down silos, and I'd say that was the big thing we all rallied around. Cool,
and so that's really interesting, because like big cultural changes, especially in large organizations like RBC, can come up against a lot of resistance and can take a lot of time. So it sounds like you were able to make that shift without too much pain, and that I'm sure a lot of the developers were really excited for this change of development as well.
Yeah, I would say we've seen a lot more people get involved, and I'd say like from when I was a developer coding every day, I didn't really have a network, and I didn't really know too many people, to now where we have our again, if you watch the video, I'm sure there's also promotional videos of how our Slack community has grown. The community is just so vibrant. If I look back at my days, I had no idea how many people were in the organization. Now I can say I met so many different people working on different problems. We are very collaborative, and it truly broke down the silo. GitHub was key, Slack was key, and just the right people that we hire. And we really hire key leaders and open source enthusiasts and key contributors to big open source projects are now part of this company, know how to work collaboratively.
Cool. That's awesome. And just I got one last question, and I guess this sort of touches on more of the legal side of things that you're talking about. One of those cons of open source of like, how often does your developer team have to deal with the legal stuff with new open source projects? Like, has RBC figured out a way to streamline that process, or is it still something you're working towards?
So I'll say, like, right off the bat, when we work with open source projects, it's always in our best intention to use the software respectfully and as part of the guidelines. And there are situations where, we may have used something, and we will work with the vendor to make sure that we, properly pay for whatever we were using. We haven't hit anything major. Because at the end of the day, we want to contribute back to the community. So if we've made a mistake or something, like which I haven't seen, I personally, I'll get involved, and I'd be happy to rectify that in those situations. Because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we help the community drive forward, and their success in the community is our success because we're using that software. So we want to see them succeed, and we want to make sure we pay our fair share of using their software.
Awesome. Well, I don't see any other questions popping in right now. I'm just getting a message from sort of the crew on the back end. I think that's sort of I think that's everything that I have on my end. Yeah. The message was just about jumping on and talking about what's coming up next. But I just want to say thanks again, Anthony, for the presentation. That was great. I learned a lot. And I think our audience learned a lot as well about what RBC is like and what it actually means to work there. So yeah, thanks again. And thanks to RBC for sort of coming on board and helping us drive this initiative.
Great. Thank you, guys. Keep up the good work.